What's up, guys? Now, we all know about Nick Diaz's interview that has gone a bit viral. I mean, a lot of quotes from there, a lot of great stuff to take away from that interview, and it was a very Nick Diaz interview. Some of the usual mannerisms, the usual attitudes, the usual speech impediments. But the thing is, he looked a bit irritated, not only with the state of his MMA career, what has happened to him in the past, because he always alluded to the past whenever Ariel Helwani asked something for the present, which tells you that most likely something still irks him. And something recently is the way Jorge Masvidal went after Nate Diaz, verbally telling him he's gonna baptize him, all that kind of stuff, telling him, how can you say that you're gonna baptize someone's little brother and stuff like that. And that brings into what's happening now. Nick Diaz is calling out Jorge Masvidal for a fight. Now, here are some things about Nick Diaz. He has been out of the game for nearly 5 years. He hasn't fought since January 31st of 2015. And you gotta also take the time off before that fight. The fight before that fight was against George St. Pierre, March 16 of 2013. And before that, he only fought once in 2012. And before that, he fought in 2011. So there's a lot of inconsistencies when it comes to getting his opponent and fighting. And he has not won a fight since 2011, 8 years ago, when he fought BJ Penn. And with this time off, you look at his social media, you look at his Instagram specifically, and he seems to be enjoying himself, partying, drinking, doing all kinds of different stuff. And I hope it's not too much of ill influences that will decline his readiness for a potential fight, because he absolutely wants to fight Jorge Masvidal. Whenever he calls someone out, is someone that Nick Diaz will show up for. Look how he called out George St. Pierre. I believe he called out Carlos Condit. I mean, whenever he calls you out, because he hates fighting, he doesn't want to call people out. He never calls people out. But when he goes out of his way and does just that, you know that Nick Diaz is serious and he's going to train for it. And actually, coincidentally, there is footage of Nick Diaz training now. And this is right after he called out Jorge Masvidal on Instagram. Not only the interview, when he was telling that it was on the UFC, when he was saying that it was on Dana White, when he was saying that it's on you guys to make this kind of fight, he goes out and tries to make it himself with a more formal call out on Instagram. Quote, thank you at Ariel Helwani for letting me come on. Had a long week, I was a little worked up. At Game Bred Fighter at UFC, give the fans the real shit what they want to see. Unquote. Kind of hard to tell where the pauses should be because there's no punctuations anywhere. But so this seems like a much more formal of a call out than what we saw in the past and what we saw in his usual career when he called out George St. Pierre and asked him where he at, live in front of everybody. And he did say that he was a little bit worked up and had a long week. So potentially the social anxiety from Nick Diaz was at an all-time high for that interview, and that is why a lot of people thought that he has some kind of problem. But the thing is, I believe Nick Diaz always sounded this way, but he has a little bit different substance when it came to what he was actually talking about. Maybe a little bit under the influence for the past week or so. He did say he had a long week, so potentially he went through something like that. You know, as long as he's not doing it too hard, as long as it's not affecting him badly, what can you really say, right? If it is affecting him badly, and a lot of people seem to think so, it is a problem, right? And especially going into a fight, getting off all this kind of stuff, the partying life. Like he said before, he doesn't like to fight, he likes to party. That is not the right kind of mindset. That's not the right kind of place to get right into a high-level elite fight on the grandest stage of the world against an actual assassin in the UFC who's taking out everybody and looking to finish everybody and hurt their health. He did the same thing to Nate Diaz, right? His little brother. And that is where this is all coming from. Nick Diaz wants to avenge his little brother, calling out the man that in a way failed on his hit on Nate Diaz. He didn't get to finish that fight. He didn't get to end it the way he wanted. And Nick Diaz wants to step up before anything else happens and get that revenge for his little brother. And with this call out on Instagram, Jorge Masvidal actually responded. Not that cartoonish thing, I don't know what you call that, the video that his manager put out, and not the interview that Masvidal kind of shunned Nick Diaz away with. Jorge Masvidal responded with, quote, would be an honor, I'm 100 in for this fight, hashtag resurrection, unquote. And we know when he's hashtagging resurrection, he's going in with bad intentions, man. And if Jorge Masvidal wants this, Nick Diaz wants this, you know the UFC is probably going to want it because it sells a lot. I actually do believe that this fight potentially sells more than the Nate Diaz fight because the Nate Diaz fight happened. You cannot take that away from Nate. Nate taking a fight with Jorge Masvidal set up this narrative and set up this story that now brings Nick Diaz in, right? If Nate didn't fight Jorge Masvidal in the first place, Nick Diaz versus Jorge wouldn't be as big, right? I still believe Nate would have been bigger than if Nick fought Jorge initially, because Nate Diaz is a bigger star these days. But because Nate fought Jorge, the Nick fight is even more pleasing and creates more of a story that continues what's going on. The big brother, the legend, stepping in for his little brother after taking time off, and he's very motivated to do so because of all the stuff that's going into this. There's a motivating factor that speaks to the casual audience. It speaks to everybody. Everybody knows about that kind of story, right? The big brother steps in for the little brother when something's wrong with the little brother, or in the big brother's eyes, the little brother needs help. It's a story that a lot of people can relate to, and this is why a lot of people are on Nick Diaz's side. The story is great. You can create a movie after this, especially if Nick Diaz wins. But here is the reality. I believe there's going to be a reality check for everybody who believes in this kind of thing, who believes in this story, who believes in Nick Diaz coming back after 5 years off almost against one of the absolute best welterweights in the world, who has reinvented himself and has been active in the game and very motivated, as a big goal that he hasn't met yet, and he'll do anything to get to it. And when money's involved, there's more motivation for Jorge Masvidal as well. And not just the time off, and not just the partying life. Yes, that stuff affects you mentally, and that may be the most important thing, but also the stylistic collision of these two is not going to be that far off of Masvidal handling Nick Diaz, right? People don't understand the differences between Nate and Nick when it comes to their style. A lot of people think that they're just kind of the same fighter, but Nick is at a higher level because he's more of a legend, he's older, he's been in the game a little bit more. It's not true at all. Nate Diaz is a lot more of a counterpuncher than Nick is, and he creates distance and keeps that distance a lot more than Nick does. Nick walks you down with a plodding style, no cutting off of the ring, pushes you against the cage off volume boxing, keeps a jab in your face mostly, will switch orthodox and southpaw, which is something Nate doesn't do that much. Nate kind of stays in southpaw for the most part of the fight, and Nick is looking to go to your body, mix up to the body and the head, and always keep that pressure on you with volume shots, and he does commit a lot more with power than Nate does. He has more power than Nate, and he doesn't rock back the way Nate does. Nick will just keep moving forward. He doesn't move back that much. He used to in his early UFC career, like when he knocked out Robbie Lawler, but in the midst of his career and the end of it, he never really fought like that. Always just moving forward, plodding. Nate will keep a jab on you, leaning on you with a 1-2 or a right hook and a left straight, and then he'll rock back and lean away from your punch and counter you with a right hook. This is a very consistent approach that Nate brings into every single fight, and he throws more kicks than Nick does as well. And he's a lot more on the back foot than Nick is. Nick is always moving forward no matter who he's fighting. Nate will move backwards so he can counter you a little bit more, so he can feel you out a little bit more and get the timing of your punches before he starts throwing back at you. Now this can get him in the way of getting picked apart, like Conor McGregor did in the second fight where he was dropping Nate Diaz, because Nate does cover up the same way Nick does. The thing about Nick is he is more susceptible to getting countered than Nate is. Nate is more susceptible to getting attacked first. Nick is more susceptible to getting countered as he's moving forward or intercepted because of his pressure, and he will keep a high guard, and he's throwing a lot more than Nate is as the fight starts. So generally speaking, the more normie way to look at it is Nick moves forward more, Nate moves back more, Nick pressures more, Nate counters more. Nick works on the inside a lot more, Nate works on the outside a lot more, and Nate works in the clinch a lot more than Nick does. The punches are pretty similar, the shot selection is very similar. Nick goes to the body more than Nate does. When it comes to BJJ, they're very similar in their styles actually. Now how does this deal with Jorge Masvidal? Well, the thing is, Jorge commits a lot more power these days. He explodes out of nowhere more than he ever did before. And the way Nick plods and pressures you with no footwork really, no cutting off the ring or anything like that, it allows Jorge Masvidal, yes, he's gonna get moved back like he did against Nick Diaz, but he's able to get away from the cage easier than Nate. Nate uses a lot better footwork and moves around a lot more than Nick does. And because of this, even if Nick gets Jorge Masvidal up against the cage, he's not going to be able to work that much. Jorge moves these days. Jorge is pretty fast, and if Nick is going to keep walking forward, covering up, Masvidal can use him more so like a punching bag. Even his hands, even his arms, just throws shots and try to get around the gloves. A big right overhand is going to be a big weapon for Masvidal, especially if he steps on the outside like he caught Nick Diaz as well. The body kicks, the leg kicks are still going to be there. The thing is about Nick Diaz, you cannot leg kick him as much as you can Nate. Nate, again, rocks forward and back, and when you rock back and lean away from punches, your front leg is exposed, and because of that, he's also keeping a wide stance. Nick is pretty narrow for the most part of the fight, and he's moving forward. It's harder to leg kick someone moving forward, but the body kicks and the knees are a lot more in play now. And I believe Masvidal is a lot better in the clinch than Nick is as well. He got the better of Nate Diaz in the clinch fix the hand fighting problems that Nate brings into every fight, and able to land elbows and stuff like that. I don't think Nick is ready for that as well, and the takedown defense is not going to allow Nick to even go to the ground, and Masvidal has shown that he is very much capable to fight anybody when it comes to the ground. Look at his fight with Damian Maia. If you can survive Damian Maia and even compete with him somewhat in certain situations, certain positions, he can absolutely go on the ground with Nick Diaz and feel comfortable. Very similar how he was against Nate. Now, if this is a prime Nick Diaz, I think it will be more competitive than Nate. A prime Nick, I believe, competes a lot better than prime Nate does against Jorge, specifically because of his pressure and his power, and he covers up a lot more than Nate does, right? He'll walk down into your punches, and this forces Jorge to take different kind of angles. But I still think he gets in the way of the overhand right. I still think he gets in the way of the body kick. I think he gets knee to the body. I think he gets elbowed if it gets into the clinch because he tries to work to the body and dig his head into your chest. And Jorge will just mix up the game and not allow that to happen. The biggest thing also is Nick Diaz is not going to be able to pressure Jorge and keep him on the cage as he likes. And if you go back and look at my breakdown of Jorge versus Nate Diaz, I highlight of what Jorge was doing to Nate when he was side kicking the leg and then jabbing him in the face. I called it kind of a double spear tactic where he kind of keeps Nate Diaz away from the long range and the mid range. And this will work a lot more on Nick. The side kick to the knee, when someone's walking you down and moving forward only, it works a lot better on them to halt them. So this I don't think is going to change too much. And this potentially can set up different kind of punches and stuff that Jorge didn't see against Nate Diaz that will work against Nick. Right? Nick walks forward all the time and those right hands are going to be coming into his face in opposite stance, and potentially Jorge can fake a takedown and work his way up to the head as well. There's a lot of things Jorge can work against Nick Diaz, and again, with all of the mental stuff going in for Nick, I think it's going to be a beating from Jorge Masvidal. As much of a Nick Diaz fan that I am, and as much of an MMA fan that I am, I see this fight going very, very badly for Nick Diaz if it ever happens in the near future. Now, they were supposed to fight last year or in talks or something like that. I made a video about that a while ago. At least we would have been a lot more ignorant of where Nick Diaz is in his life, where he is mentally and stuff, because there weren't that much that were brought into light, right? We kind of thought that Nick Diaz was probably still training, he was probably still doing some of the usual things, and he's not fighting this assassin and Jorge Masvidal. Masvidal was a different guy then, but now he's facing a resurrected Masvidal who's on a mission to take out everybody in this division, and he can get paid for a Nick Diaz fight, which is, I believe, easier than his fight with Nate Diaz. Pretty much a win-win for Jorge Masvidal. Easier fight, more pay, makes him bigger in the sport, and people are going to be calling him out left and right. Look at Usman. Usman didn't want to fight him before, I believe, and now he's calling out Masvidal. I could be wrong on that, but if my memory serves correctly, I think Usman kind of turned him down before. Said that Jorge Masvidal didn't deserve him or something like that. And now he's saying he wants to fight Masvidal. You're going to hear a lot more of this after he beats Nick Diaz, because Jorge becomes the money fight of the welterweight division. So if you're Jorge Masvidal, why not take this? You win so much off of this. And if you're Nick Diaz, you go on with it because you do have the motivation, but if you're in his corner, if you're someone who's looking from the outside in, maybe stopping him would be the best thing. Or at least give him a tune-up fight, get him to training a lot more, and then get that tune-up fight, and then see how he is, and then maybe call out Jorge Masvidal later. I know it doesn't serve the story that well, but for Nick Diaz's health, for his career, it would probably be a lot better to do that. Because if he comes up a devastating loss like this, it will possibly taint the Diaz name. Both brothers losing to Jorge Masvidal, how crazy would that be? Very reminiscent to Scarface, right? So leave a comments below what you guys think about all this. What do you guys think that Nick Diaz should be doing? What do you guys think about the fight, potentially, stylistically? What do you think that Masvidal should be doing? And again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.